New Zealand is experiencing an unprecedented wave of outward migration. At the same time, workers' confidence in the domestic job market continues to erode, reflecting a deep and growing pessimism about the country's economic prospects. In 2024 alone, tens of thousands of New Zealand citizens chose to leave in search of opportunities to live and work abroad, clear evidence that domestic economic pressures have exceeded what many households can reasonably endure. For decades, New Zealand was widely regarded as a model of livability, exceptional natural environments, stable political institutions, and a high standard of living. That image earned the country both global admiration and sustained inflows of immigrants. Yet behind this paradise facade, the economic foundations are fracturing. Today, New Zealand is facing its most severe recession since 1991. The consequences are spreading across society. Rising living costs are forcing many families into a daily struggle just to meet basic needs. Housing prices have far outpaced incomes, pushing a large share of young people to abandon the dream of homeownership altogether. As employment security, housing affordability, and the capacity to build savings weaken simultaneously, social trust is steadily being worn away. This raises a fundamental question. What happened to this paradise? More importantly, what is unfolding in New Zealand is not an isolated case. It is a signal of structural cracks emerging across many advanced economies today, including your own. New Zealand's economy is often marketed as stable, green, and business-friendly. But once that image is stripped away, it becomes clear that the country's prosperity rests on a far narrower foundation than commonly assumed. Roughly 60% of total merchandise exports come from a small number of primary commodities, most of which are shipped in near raw form, with very limited downstream processing. The largest pillar within this structure is dairy. Each year, dairy exports generate around 18 billion New Zealand dollars, nearly 1/4 of total merchandise exports. For decades, this sector has been the engine of rural growth and a reliable source of foreign exchange. However, high concentration also implies high risk. Approximately 26% of New Zealand's dairy exports are dependent on the Chinese market, tying a substantial share of this economic pillar to the demand conditions and policy environment of a single trading partner. Following dairy, beef, and lamb exports account for roughly 8.4 billion New Zealand dollars annually, or close to 12% of total goods exports. Forestry ranks next, contributing about 5 billion New Zealand dollars per year. But in forestry, the core problem lies in the value structure. Most output is exported as raw logs, packed into containers and shipped overseas for further processing. As a result, high value-added activities and the bulk of associated employment are created outside New Zealand's borders. Seafood contributes roughly 2.5 billion New Zealand dollars, or about 3.5% of merchandise exports. High-value agriculture, including kiwi fruit, apples, and wine, accounts for around 3.5 billion New Zealand dollars, or approximately 5%. Despite their stronger branding potential and higher margins, these sectors remain secondary within the overall export structure. The imbalance becomes clear when compared with high technology and advanced manufacturing sectors, industries that drive innovation, productivity, and long-term growth. In these areas, New Zealand continues to lag behind many other advanced economies. High technology exports account for only about 13% of manufacturing exports. This translates into a very small share of New Zealand's total goods exports, well below the OECD average. Across OECD rankings, New Zealand consistently falls below average in the share of high-value and high-technology goods exports. By contrast, many advanced economies have successfully built value-added industries that support higher productivity, higher wages, and more stable tax bases. The comparison points to a clear reality. New Zealand's export structure remains heavily dependent on primary commodities. That dependence carries three distinct structural risks. First, environmental limits. These are most visible in the dairy sector, which faces mounting pressure related to water use and pollution. Second, climate risk. Droughts reduce dairy output. Rising ocean temperatures affect fish stocks. Storms damage orchards and agricultural infrastructure. Third, market and geopolitical risk. With roughly 26% of dairy exports tied to China, any downturn in demand, trade dispute, or geopolitical tension could deliver a sharp shock to New Zealand's export earnings. Taken as a whole, New Zealand resembles a country sitting on a gold mine but selling only unrefined ore. Most of the value added and the long-term economic gains is generated elsewhere. Alongside these export structure weaknesses, New Zealand has spent decades not merely operating a housing market, but cultivating an obsession with real estate. In recent years, rents have risen steadily nationwide, including in major economic and education centers such as Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, and Christchurch. At the heart of the problem is housing affordability. New Zealand now ranks among the most expensive housing markets in the world, far beyond the reach of most workers. Since 2000, house prices have risen at roughly 4 times the pace of wages. Incomes have failed to keep up with housing costs, and the gap has continued to widen over time. For younger generations, the consequences are clear. Homeownership is no longer a goal that can be planned for. It has become an increasingly remote possibility. Over the same period, the national average house price has increased by nearly 400,000 New Zealand dollars. The average annual salary now stands at approximately 65,852 New Zealand dollars. In Auckland, the country's largest city, the average house price has reached around 990,000 New Zealand dollars. This means that a typical Auckland home costs more than 14 times the average annual income. Even under the most unrealistic assumption devoting every dollar of income to purchasing a home, with no spending on food, rent, or other necessities, a worker would still need more than 14 consecutive years to achieve it. This structural imbalance helps explain why government interventions to date have produced little meaningful change. If homeownership has become unattainable, is renting the alternative? In practice, the answer is no. On average, people living in shared rental housing spend about 56% of their weekly income on rent. In Auckland, median weekly rents are around 650 New Zealand dollars, compared with a national average of roughly 575 New Zealand dollars. When the majority of income is absorbed by rent, little remains for food, clothing, and other basic necessities. This is not merely a financial strain, it represents a direct erosion of living standards and psychological well-being. However, high housing costs are not a random outcome. Between 2018 and 2024, the number of newly built homes nationwide actually increased faster than population growth. Yet most of this new supply failed to materialize in the areas where demand was strongest. In major cities such as Auckland, housing demand continues to far outstrip supply, forcing renters into intense competition for a limited number of units, inevitably pushing rents even higher. At the same time, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand maintained ultra-low interest rates for an extended period, with the official cash rate falling to as low as 0.25%. Borrowing to buy property became cheaper than ever before. In just 2 years, from 2020 to 2021, average house prices surged by 32.3%. A large-scale housing bubble took shape. Today, many loans taken out during that period are being reset at interest rates of around 6% or higher. This means monthly mortgage payments for many households are rising sharply within a very short time frame. For families already operating near their financial limits, this interest rate shock is no longer a matter of budgeting. Rising debt repayments are translating directly into a growing risk of default. Yet the housing crisis is only one part of a much broader picture. An even deeper structural weakness is compounding New Zealand's economic challenges. Chronic underinvestment in the future. At present, New Zealand spends roughly 1.4% of gross domestic product on research and development. The OECD average stands at 2.7%, nearly double. Low research and development spending means few high-value industries take root. As a result, the economy increasingly lacks jobs that pay wages high enough to retain skilled workers. Between 2012 and 2022, New Zealand's labor productivity grew by an average of just 0.3% per year. Over the same period, the OECD average was 1.5%. When productivity stagnates, long-term growth becomes fragile. In 2023, New Zealand ranked 50th globally in exports of deeply processed goods, underscoring its continued reliance on raw or low-value exports compared with peer economies. But the most troubling signal is not found in trade data, it is found in people. The brain drain to Australia is not new, but it has now reached crisis scale. The reason is straightforward. Average wages in Australia are about 26% higher for the same jobs. In some sectors, income gaps reach as much as 200%. Nearly 74,000 New Zealand citizens departed in the year to August 2025, up from the previous record of 73,300. It followed record numbers leaving through 2023 and into 2024, an outflow that can only be described as historic. Nearly 12,000 New Zealand nurses registered to work in Australia, representing a 53% increase in just 1 year. This has left many domestic hospitals facing severe staff shortages, with growing risks to patient safety. Meanwhile, New Zealand's Ministry of Education projects a shortfall of around 1,250 teachers, leading to larger class sizes and fewer educational options for students. Even sectors viewed as engines of the future are not immune. In technology and information technology, more than 50% of the workforce is now made up of immigrants. This figure points to a stark reality. New Zealand is failing to train enough high-skilled workers domestically to meet its own needs. In Australia, job opportunities are more diverse, career progression is faster, and the pressure of living costs from food to rent and mortgage payments is often lower relative to income. As the workforce leaves the country at an accelerating pace, another equally serious trend is unfolding in parallel. New Zealand's population is aging rapidly. At present, roughly 18% of the population is aged 65 or older. By 2034, that share is projected to rise to 21%. Pension costs, already among the largest items in the national budget, will continue to expand precisely as the pool of workers contributing to the system shrinks. Fertility rates have been declining for years, meaning fewer young people are entering the labor force, just as the number of retirees continues to grow. The result is a worsening dependency ratio, fewer taxpayers supporting a larger population reliant on public transfers. Around 400,000 people are currently dependent on social welfare, the highest level since the 1990s. Inequality continues to widen, and homeownership is increasingly out of reach for a large share of the population. For many New Zealanders, the prospect of long-term stability has been replaced by a constant struggle to maintain a basic standard of living. An aging population, a shrinking workforce, rising healthcare costs, deteriorating infrastructure, and deepening inequality. At this point, the core question is no longer what is happening, but whether New Zealand will act early enough to reverse this trajectory. Ultimately, the question is this: what kind of New Zealand will be left for the next generation?